just got back. Tell us about your trip.
Oh, okay. You're right. I did just get back. Oh, actually, did you know when I was there, I got to go to one of these national cemeteries, and when I was there and I was walking around, I got to see all of these headstones there, and it just sort of made me start to think, and I started to wonder, like, why do they serve?
Well, there are lots of reasons. There's patriotism, national tragedies, serve for the greater good, family.
My name is David Moniak, and this is my story. I was the first of my kind to enroll in the military academy at West Point. Native Americans had nothing to do with the U.S. military at that point, partly because we were not welcome. Some doubted my dedication to the cause because it was so unusual for someone like me to be in their ranks. You also have to remember, I enrolled in 1817. People viewed other races differently back then. I showed them they were wrong, though, on all accounts. I worked hard and astonished them with how quickly I was able to pick up concepts. I was able to understand complex mathematical concepts such as sine or cosine with only a couple years of formal education. People were surprised by my intelligence and considered me a marvel. John Adams, a former president, even wanted to meet with me at one point, although I was a bit too bashful to talk to him. After graduation in 1822, I was commissioned as a brevet second lieutenant, although I did leave after a brief time to go back home. I had received a letter from my uncle detailing my father's money and alcohol problems back home. It was a hard choice to make, but I had a duty to my family, so I left the service with hopes that I could return and pay them back for my education. In these calmer years, I settled down and found somebody to love, Mary. We married and we even had a son, whom I named after myself. We were a wonderful family of three, David, Mary, and David Jr. When David Jr. was just 3 years old, I knew that now was the right time to return to the service. It wasn't long into the war when they realized my skill and I was promoted to a major. By that point, I knew that I had proven all the doubters wrong. I had showed that even I, a Native American, could excel and be dedicated to the cause and protection of our country. I even made the ultimate sacrifice in that war, my life. I showed the world and all those who would think less of me and my race that we were all willing to sacrifice and work hard for our country, our family, and our home.
I think we should talk about the inequality in that.
Yes.
Yep.
Because throughout the history of this nation, inequality has existed, but there are still those who have been discriminated against who are fighting to protect others who have also been oppressed.
My name is Archie Hawkins, and this is my story. I was born February 12th, 1902, in a small town called Lloyd, Florida. My family was poor, and I didn't even go to school, but that was actually fairly common back then. When I was a kid, we moved to another small town, Greenville, Florida, and I decided to register for the draft. War was on everyone's mind, and there was a big one in Europe. I figured it was only a matter of time before we got dragged in. Service would get me away from the farm. I'd be paid, fed, and housed. I hoped I could also get more rights for my people. Being black in this country was not easy. I figured as a serviceman, I'd be treated better. There was just one problem. I was only 15. So I told them that I was born in 1896, so they think I was 21. They rejected me, but I didn't let that stop me. When we moved back to Lloyd, I tried again. This time, I successfully enlisted in the Army. The country was fighting what we now call World War I. I was sent to Camp Joseph E. Johnston in Jacksonville, Florida, in a segregated unit. I guess I should have expected that. We never got sent to Europe, but we were hit hard with sickness. We dropped like flies. This made the boys in charge give us war risk insurance, which we should have had anyway. After 3 months, I was discharged. I had hoped serving my country would open more doors and bring about equality, but I was wrong. By 1920, I was still unemployed. Riots and discrimination were everywhere. There was even a welcome home benefit given for the veterans in my county. White veterans, that is. I wasn't allowed. Eventually, I moved to St. Petersburg, Florida, became a gardener, and I started my own family. On February 27th, 1989, I passed away. In life, I served in a segregated unit. I faced prejudice, violence, and discrimination. In death, whites and blacks, privates and generals, it doesn't matter. We all share the same plot of land.
Well, back then, women mostly served in non-combat roles, like in military nurses, or like desk jobs, or paperwork, something like that.
Yeah, and then there's no draft for women, so they volunteer.
My name is Mary G. Sutherland. I was born November 1st, 1895 in Massachusetts to my incredible parents. They immigrated from Ireland to start a new life here. My dad, John, was a blacksmith. We were a large family with 6 siblings, so you can imagine that there were a lot of mouths to feed. Massachusetts had a lot of factories, though, so we were able to get work. That was until the war broke out. It had been raging in Europe for a few years, but the US had not yet become involved. But in 1917, we declared war on Germany and officially entered into a world war, the first any of us had ever seen. I had to do something, but I'm a woman who was going to want my help. Women didn't even have the right to vote, let alone a place in the military. Luckily for me, there was one branch of that time that saw the value of women and their work in the military, an entity that required my skill, my capability, and in result, needed me during our country's most desperate hour, the United States Navy. So on September 3rd, 1918, I enlisted. My rank was Yeoman F, a title indicating that I was female. My enlistment caused quite a stir. My role was a non-combat one, but my family was still worried. Truth be told, so was I. I was terrified. This was a huge decision and a dangerous one. But I knew it was the right one. Just because I was a woman didn't mean I couldn't do something. I had to do something. I had a calling to serve my country. My husband also served. Because women were given non-combat roles, we did an odd assortment of activities. We served as truck drivers, mechanics, cryptographers, and telephone operators. Additionally, women faced a great deal of inequality during our service. There were no medical exams for women, and we often faced issues regarding our housing and uniforms. There weren't enough. The Navy was not prepared for women. I was released from my service in 1920. Everyone called it the war to end all wars. I wasn't sure about that, but I hoped it to be true. Things seemed to be turning around. Soon after I got home, the 19th Amendment was passed. I could now legally vote. My voice would now be heard. I could make a difference in peacetime. And I did. On September 28th, 1988, I passed away. I left behind 3 children, 13 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. Because of my service and sacrifice in a time when women weren't considered equal, they now have a voice. My headstone serves as a reminder, with me on the front and my husband on the back, a unique case since most women are on the back. I passed away first, and as a result, remained on the front. Women, too, can make a difference, not only in times of war, but in times of peace and prosperity.
And then when you think about all that time and all of the history in this country and all the wars that we've
Yeah,
been...
and there's been quite a few wars.
Yes, there have.
Yeah, and some veterans served in more than one, or at least tried to.
My name is William Henry Oliver, and this is my story. I was born and raised in Albany, New York around the turn of the century and child of Canadian immigrants. For people like me, America was the land of opportunity. Having 3 older sisters and 2 younger brothers, that opportunity meant work, and I started working as soon as I was able to support my parents and siblings. I worked as a printer, back at the start of the war overseas, which we refer to as World War I now, and relieved that we as a country were following a policy of non-intervention which kept us out of the war. But the time for staying out of it passed, and the U.S. declared war on Germany in 1917, and I registered for the draft. I didn't get much time in the war, barely a year in all honesty, but I was proud of that year and proud to have served my country when they needed me most. I'd never been out of the country, so it was both exciting and terrifying to be shipped out to France right out of the gate. It was also scary the kind of fighting we were doing out there with the 2nd Pioneer Infantry, part of the American Expeditionary Forces. But I was fighting for my family and for their safety, so I tried not to pay it any mind and focus on the work at hand. Then the war ended. It was 1919 and I was suddenly a civilian again, back working as a printer. I got married to a woman named Marguerite, but it didn't last. I got married again in 1943 to my wife Palma, and this time it stuck. She's stuck with me, that is. Then I got married again in 1943 to my wife Palma, and this time it stuck. She's stuck with me, that is. I love that woman, and she's got a really big heart. I met her while she was working for the hospital, and she was superintendent for 15 years, I think. And she continued to stay involved with the medical community throughout our time together. Got appointed head of the medical property office of the Emergency Medical Service of Civilian Defense. And she got recognized for 25 years of service with the Red Cross, too. She's got moxie, that one. I registered for the old man's draft back in '42, and just around the time the Second World War broke out. I was 46 at the time, so they rightly didn't ask me to go in and fight with all the young men, but it was about the principle of the thing. If and when my country needed me, I was ready and willing to fight for it.
I just think it's so fascinating how that call to service can be so powerful and how it speaks to so many different people. It just it ignites something in a person to help and to serve.
My name is William H. Soki, and this is my story. I guess I should start at the beginning. I was raised in Connecticut during one of the hardest times in American history. After all, with all the big plantations moving south because production was cheaper and taking most of the jobs with them. Then, the Great Depression hit us, somewhere in the early 1930s. And that's when things got bad. Finding a job wasn't just hard, it was impossible. It's sort of what got me to join the Army. First time, anyway. Steady job for steady pay. After 4 years, I returned to civilian life like I'd never left. It was good, though, because during my time out was when I met the love of my life. Married her, too. Gladys is my everything. And when I decided to re-enlist after Pearl Harbor, she supported me. I couldn't have survived that war without her. This time around, I served 6 years, got out, and realized that this is what I want to do with my life. I fought in World War II and following Korean War, and my wife stood by me always. She even became active in veterans for foreign wars with me, all through the 50s and 60s, and even after I retired. Then, our most proud moment, when our son Thaddeus followed my footsteps and joined the Air Force.
And then when you think about all that time and all of the history in this country and all the wars that we've
Yeah,
been...
and there's been quite a few wars.
Yes, there have.
Yeah, and some veterans served in more than one, and it's quite good.
My name is William Charette, and this is my story. By the age of 5, both my parents had been deceased. But graciously, my uncle had taken me in and guided me like the good man he is. He raised me in the rural area of Ludington, on a farm full of dairy cows, until I got a summer job on the ferry. My experience with ships and sailing among the Great Lakes, so beautiful, so vast, led me to enlist in the Navy as a sailor. So I volunteered my time instead of being drafted like the others. And I had received my training at the Naval Station Great Lakes, becoming a hospital corpsman. My career continued until March 18th, 2012, where I had passed away due to heart complications. I had a son pass before me, and I was survived by a son as well, including my wife Louise and our 3 daughters. 4 years later, Louise had joined me in the Bushnell National Cemetery. There are some hospitals and organizations named after me, as well as some sailors who had received entry-level training under me, all of who will continue my legacy.
What happens if you're in service and then a national tragedy happens?
I'm Stephen Cousins, and this is my story. In 1966, I was a 17-year-old man who enlisted in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam War. I wasn't drafted. I volunteered. I was trained in communications. It was my job to make sure that every soldier, sailor, and Marine got all the information they needed to survive. I did my best to save as many lives as possible. When 1969 came around, I was released from my service back to an uninviting country. Part of the reason I enlisted was because my father before me had done so. I wanted to be like him, a hero. But when I returned, I came back to a country that didn't want me. When my father and his fellow fighters returned, they were welcomed as warriors who would do anything for the country. When we returned, anti-war protesters only saw us as murderers. And they made sure we remembered that. I understand why they were against the war, but we were just doing what we thought was right for our country. I was doing it for the men next to me, fighting with me, dying beside me. And it was the least they could do to not hate me. I spent the rest of my days in California, where I began my eternal rest in 1997. I find it funny. I ended up in the same place as the heroes from World War II. In the end, we're all the same. Men and women who sacrificed for the country when they didn't have anything else to give. In the end, we all end up in the same place. All of us, fighting for our home. And that's what really mattered.
Researching all these people made me realize why my grandpa was in the military now.
Oh, tell us about him.
Yeah, see, I thought he was just doing it so his children could have a better life, but now I know he did it because he loved this country. He wants to fight for equality. Yeah, and these are real life people, like mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, cousins, grandparents, real people making a difference and changing history.
Creating a legacy.
We are your history, your veterans, and you are our legacy.